All right, guys, let's do a quick speed run, and then we'll call it a day. Yeah, this is a fun stream. Okay, so we are rated 888, and I think we are ready to begin. Once again, we're going to do 10 plus 0, which I think is a very happy medium between the longer 15-minute games without getting into blitz territory. Let's get this show on the road. Welcome to those watching on YouTube.
Not really.
So, apologies for those watching on YouTube. My internet briefly cut out, but we are back, and I think you can hear me properly. So, the reason I don't want to pause or abort this game is because we finally got a Glek system. Which is why I really do want to play this game. So, just to bring everybody up to speed, we played the 4 knights. I played G3, which is my official recommendation this speedrun. This is the Glek system. Those who've watched my speedrun already have kind of a good base of understanding of what this is. After Bishop G2, our opponent plays kind of a very typical response at this level, which is Knight to G4. And if you're unfamiliar with this, it may seem very intimidating, but of course we can simply castle. And in most of these positions, Knight takes F2, followed by Bishop takes F2, leads to a position in which we have 2 pieces for a rook and a pawn. But in the middle game, the rooks are simply not mobilized. They're not deployed. And so the 2 pieces dominate. Hopefully I'll have a chance to demonstrate that. So Black plays D6. And we have a choice here. Of course, we can play H3 and chase the knight out of G4. There is not necessarily a hurry to play this move. We can also play the move D3. But there is really no reason to wait. Let's go H3. Let's force Black to commit, because Black now has to make a decision. Our opponent drops back to H6, which is a slightly odd square for the knight. Now, immediately when I see the move Knight H6, 2 things come to mind. I think our opponent's idea is probably to quickly play F7, F5, which is a potentially suicidal move given that Black's king is stuck in the center. So we don't really need to change our strategy here. We play the same moves that we normally play in the Glek system, which is what I like about this opening. We simply play the move D3. Preparing to complete our development and creating the positional threat of Bishop takes H6, which our opponent completely ignores. Now, those of you who've watched the speedrun a lot know that I always put an emphasis on not overestimating the impact of pawn structure. So in this situation, Bishop takes H6 is not a move that I would necessarily play automatically. But the reason it's good is not because it ruins Black's pawn structure per se, but rather because Black's king is castled to the same side. So, incidentally, if Black had played a move like Bishop E6, I would have been a lot more hesitant to take on H6. Because Black is castled to this side of the board, this is much more effective. Now, of course, we have a very easily attackable target on H6, and there's kind of a low-hanging fruit move that we could play in order to attack that target, which is Queen to D2. This move is predicated on a very important tactical detail, which is very commonly overlooked by newer players in the Glek. Queen F6 is, I think, a lot of players' instinct, right? To play Queen F6, get the queen into the game, and it walks right into this very nasty knight jump to D5, which hits C7. This is exactly what happens. Notice the power of our bishop on G2. It's protecting the knight, it's protecting the pawn on H3, and it's keeping our king safe. So this Knight D5 move is just a menace in many different types of positions. But it's not the end of the story, because what threat does the move Queen G6 create? Well, those of you who have a keen tactical eye should notice that it creates the threat of Queen takes G3. But we have an incredible resource here. Now, what do I see when I look at the move Queen G6? Now, maybe some of you are noticing a move like Knight H4, but that's not what I'm talking about. Anytime you have a situation where the king and the queen are in forkable squares, and the forking square is accessible to your knight, you need to put your tactical cap on. You need to put your tactical thinking cap on, because if in some alternate reality we can deflect this knight from C6, we basically have a win in our pocket. And the moment I say that, some of you maybe were thinking knight takes e5. Well, obviously that doesn't work. It's a good thought, but Black can take with the pawn. But we can play the move b4. And I have the perfect illustration. Our opponent is completely unsuspecting here. He doesn't realize that something's the matter, missing the fork on e7, and we win the game. So this is a great introduction to whole board awareness. Whole board awareness, WBA is the acronym, which is, of course, the ability to appreciate that you can do something on one side of the board that impacts the game on another side of the board. So this move b4, why is it hard to see? Well, partially because it happens on the queen side where nothing's really going on. But you have to understand that all three sides of the board, the queen side, the center, and the king side, are intricately connected. And our opponent immediately resigns. How about that? So a quick overview of the first Glek system, but definitely not the last. Once again, apologies for the disconnection for those watching on YouTube. So the Glek system is initiated with the move g3. Now, in previous speedruns, I made a couple of other recommendations. In particular, I was recommending the 4-knight Scotch with d4, which I still stand by. I think it's a great opening, and we had a lot of success with it. But I think it's time for me to change things up a little bit. And I think the Glek system is a great opening at all levels. It's going to bring us a lot of success at this level because players don't come across this opening often and start floundering almost immediately. And I have in mind a perfect illustration of this very same concept in rather uncanny fashion. Yeah, so knight g4 castles is already a serious inaccuracy because it simply helps us develop. Now, I've had a couple of videos on the Glek where I exposed you to a little bit of theory. For now, I will just remind you of a couple of important introductory points. The first is that castles kingside is a mistake in this position. This is a mistake that has been committed by very strong GMs. It's a fairly unknown concept. What is the way to punish castles kingside? And punish in quotes. Of course, the position is still close to equal, but white is now contending for an advantage. It's the center fork trick. You play knight takes e5, and I've already talked about this at length. Bishop takes f2 is nothing to fear, particularly here because we're so close to completing the manual castle. Here we can even play the move d4, just grabbing control of the center, and not fearing this paper tiger check on g4 because we just hide our king away on g1, and we're already threatening to win a piece with e5. Black's knights are just terribly placed, and this is just unacceptably bad. So bishop f2 is not something to be afraid of. Therefore, Black's best response is knight takes e5, d4, and bishop to d6, which is, of course, the sort of typical way of maintaining the bishops. But here already Black is in a little bit of trouble because after d takes e5, bishop takes e5, castles kingside, we have superior control of the center. And what I want you to notice here is how the bishop and the pawn on e4 are operating as one unit. Right? You might look at this bishop and say, well, it's a pretty bad bishop. But think of the bishop and the pawn as one team. What is this team doing? It's clamping down on the d5 square, ensuring that Black is not going to be able to free themselves with the move d5. So most people in this position, they play the move d6. And in this position, white has an incredibly powerful response. You should pause the video if you're watching on YouTube and try to come up with this move. I have featured this in a previous video, but it's definitely good to review this line because it's going to happen in your games. So it's not f4. It's not f4 because Black is able to play bishop takes c3. And this is okay, but it's nothing special. The move is knight to e2, which is actually incredibly strong. Why is it so strong? Because you're threatening f4, trapping the bishop. Black is still unable to play d5 because you can simply take the pawn. And in order to, create space for the bishop, Black has to play a very awkward move like knight d7. And now you can just play a move like c3, bishop e3, queen c2. You just have a very stable advantage here for white. For example, knight c5, you can play bishop e3, harassing the knight. And Black's pieces are not able to find particularly good squares. If Black plays bishop e6, you start driving the pawns down the board. f4 and e5 is super strong. Now the knight is loose. Black is in huge trouble. So this is good. And if Black plays bishop takes e3 straight away, then despite the outwardly ugly pawn structure, we have the bishop pair and we have uncontested control of the dark squares. So after a move like f4, I think that white's position is still slightly better. Rook e8, Now we can play this move e5. Very typical Glek idea, f4 and e5. And in the endgame, white's bishop pair is really, really scary. Beautiful bishop on g2. The other bishop is coming out to g5. And it's very easy for black to make another mistake. And now things are getting even worse after bishop g5. So this is also quite good for white. There is more to analyze here, but we'll get to it. We'll have plenty of opportunities. This is why black's best move in this position is to play d6. And then we play d3. And I'm sure that we're going to get this position multiple times, so this is beyond the scope of the current game. In the game, we face knight g4. We castle in response. If you're a newer player watching this on YouTube, you should be very comfortable with the notion that knight takes f2 and bishop f2 is really bad for black. So does it make sense to people when I say that this position is almost winning for white? Does that make intuitive sense? The evaluation, according to the engine, is about plus 2.5. So why is it so overwhelming for white, this position? Because from a material perspective, it's equal. Black has a pawn and a rook for the two pieces. But after white starts opening up the center, essentially white is up two minor pieces because black's rooks are completely out of the game. And if black, let's say, plays e takes d4, knight takes d4, knight d4, queen d4, black's rooks are not getting into the game anytime soon, while white's minor pieces are already jumping into dominant central posts. Black can try a move like f5, but we're not going to allow black to open up the f-file. And this exacerbates things even further. So this is a pretty important rudimentary concept. This is almost never dangerous. There are some exceptions, but this is not one of them. So d6, we chase away the knight with h3. Knight h6, we open up the bishop with d3. And important moment where black castles kingside. So we didn't actually have to rush with bishop takes h6, but I think this is the simplest way to play. Now in this position, I think black's only way to hold the game would have been king to g7. King to g7 is not an easy move to play. I think newer players have a hard time using their king for defensive purposes. Now, what would we have done in response to king g7? Well, we would have moved our own king up to h2. And this is also a very thematic move in the Glek, which gets out of the pin and prepares this plan where we move the knight out of the way and then push our f-pawn 2 squares in order to open up the king side. Black is essentially powerless against this plan. Black can play f5 themselves, but that merely helps us open up the king side. For example, we can take and play knight a4 to root out this bishop, and the engine is giving about +2, which makes sense. So this is just a really, really bad position for black. Our opponent walked into knight d5, and now we get to the critical moment in the game. How do you find a move like b4? Well, I have, I think, the perfect illustration of this. Let me see if I can pull up this game. Again, we didn't get to even like the tip of the iceberg because we'll have plenty more opportunities to do that. I'm just trying to give you kind of a conceptual overview of the Glek. And we'll have plenty of opportunities to delve into the sort of theoretical particulars. Okay, here we go. So this is a game that I played a long time ago in 2007. Tells you how old I am. And this game illustrates a very similar concept to b4 in the speedrun game. So it's a crazy position that occurred out of a Sveshnikov Sicilian. And in this position, white has a very, very nice winning concept. If you're paying attention to how I'm presenting this game, the move should already be kind of announcing itself. So you might see the move, but try to understand the idea. I'll give you a moment to think about it. And it's a pretty unbalanced position, so try to kind of get your bearings first. So the basic idea is this. You should notice that black has this very loose bishop on h4. The second observation is that this rook on a2, where does it really want to be? What is the ideal square for this rook on a2? Like if you could put it on this square, white would be winning on the spot. Where does this rook want to be on a2? It wants to be on h2. So for example, if you play b3 and then you play rook a to h2, the game ends immediately because black is simply unable to retain this bishop on h4. Black can go g5. We play f takes g5. And the moment the bishop moves, all hell breaks loose and this is easy mate. So obviously the move b3 comes to mind. But b3 is a little bit slow and it gives black a very valuable tempo that black can use in order to play the move rook to b7, protecting laterally the pawn on h7. And now if we go down the same line, it's far from convincing because we're not able to capture on h7. But whole board awareness yields a brilliant concept. What if we play b4 rather than b3? So it looks like a pretty outlandish move, but the idea is very clear. If black plays a takes b4, then we're able to get our rook to h2. But what is the secondary idea of this move? What happens if black plays rook to b7, just like they would against b3? There's a second threat that this move creates. Who can spot it? Who can spot this secondary threat? Yeah, the secondary threat that this move creates is b5. And b5 is incredibly bad for black, because if the knight drops back to e7, we're able to bring our queen up to d4 with just a completely crushing attack in the center. So there's just simply nothing that black can do here. Absolutely nothing. Perhaps black can try knight a7. Let me just double check what the winning line is here. But this is clearly winning for white because you have queen d4 coming up. Yeah, rook a h2 is winning, bishop f6. And yeah, simply knight takes f6. Yeah. So you play rook a h2, bishop f6, knight takes f6, queen takes f6, and now the other knight comes into d5. And again, the problem for black is that white's queen is going to come up to d4. So in the game, my opponent acquiesced. He gave up the bishop. He gave a meaningless check. My king ran away. King c2, by the way, is a really nice move because queen a4, bishop b3, black runs out of checks. He was forced to trade queens, and I won shortly thereafter. So the theme of this game is whole board awareness. It's obviously not the same. The speedrun game was a much simpler position, but anytime you see a forkable square like this, remember that the correct move can come on the other side of the board. b4, chasing the bishop, chasing the knight, and setting up this threat of a fork. Okay? All right. Any questions? WBA. Let's get another one in. And we have the white pieces again. Let's go e4 once again. Okay, so we're facing a Scandi. We've faced the Scandinavian before, and queen to d8, which is one of the viable continuations. This is, I think, recommended by John Bartholomew. The main move, the traditional main move, is queen a5. I talked a little bit about black's options in our first Scandi game. The queen to d8 is kind of a nondescript move. Black accepts that white will have a lead in development, but if black treats this line correctly, it's incredibly solid. And it's not like black is losing or anything. So our method against queen d8 is exactly the same as our response to queen a5. The first step is to control the center with our pawn, d4. And the second step is to quickly and efficiently develop our minor pieces. Knight c6 is already a pretty bad move. Knight c6 is already a pretty bad move. Now, a lot of you, I'm sure, are very tempted by the move d5. But remember that when you push a pawn like this in the center, you're usually giving away a retreating square of some sort. So d5 runs into knight e5. d5 runs into knight e5. And then you might say, oh, but then we go bishop f4 with tempo. But then again, the knight drops back to g6. We can drop back to g3, and white is better, but there's no need for us to rush with d5. Let's start by developing our knight and taking away the e5 square from black's knight. Now d5 is much, much stronger because the black knight does not have this retreating square on e5. Now d5 is almost crushing. Knight b4. Obviously, I saw this move, and our response to this move is very important because without this response, d5 would actually be really stupid. When you push a pawn, a square is cleared by that pawn. The square that the pawn was formerly occupying is now available. This is a very common motif, and it's implemented here with knight to d4. Defending c2 and hitting the bishop, obviously you should already be eyeing this check on b5, which is going to end the game in 2 seconds. Check. And black is busted. We could have even started with a3 now that I think about it, but here we just played dc. The only downside of what I'm doing is that I did allow a queen trade, so I was actually a little bit sloppy. I should have started with a3, knight takes d5, and only then delivered the check on b5. I'll show this after the game. So yeah, this was a little bit sloppy by yours truly, but no harm, no foul. So here's the problem. If we play knight takes c6 in this position, black is going to play queen takes queen check. And then if we play king takes queen, we get into these complications, and probably our opponent is going to mess up. But I also want to kind of play objectively. I don't want to play based on the fact that our opponent is bad. So I think there's a better move. There's a very classy move in this position. It's probably not a move that's on your radar until I told you to look for it. So let's say you see knight takes c6, you're not convinced by it. What do you do in this situation? Well, do you play bishop takes c6 check? That's possible, but again, after knight c6, queen takes queen, you've allowed a queen trade and you're only up a pawn. So simply bishop to a4. Not bishop to c4 because you're running into this very typical tactic, queen takes knight. Also, you should not want to play bishop c4 because you should want to maintain the attack on the c6 pawn. Our opponent plays f6, very strange move. And now our opponent is probably preparing to play e5. And already at this point, we can play knight takes c6. But as a matter of fact, there is still no rush to play knight takes c6. Black is so underdeveloped that we can literally just complete our development casually, and there's nothing that Black will be able to do. His position is completely collapsing. So let's just castle. Let's just get our king out of the center so that we don't have to worry about Black taking our queen and having to recapture with the king, which is a little bit awkward. Finally, we're ready for knight takes c6. So in the event that Black plays e5, we play knight takes c6, and we're chilling. Yeah, and a3 is coming up next in the event that Black defends this pawn. So rook c8, we play a3, and we chase away the knight. And knight to d5. Black should have played e5. That was the only way to maintain some chances. Now the game ends very, very quickly after knight takes c6. I mean, just look at Black's king side. You cannot play an entire game of chess without developing a single piece on one side of the board. This is a good illustration of that. Also, this is why you don't play the Scandi at this level. It's just not an opening that you want to start your chess career with. Okay, so at this point, we can really decide between the flashier wins or the sort of utilitarian, I'm going to take all of Black's pieces wins, which is what I recommend. So we have this potential discovery. How do we maximize our material gain using this discovered check? So some of you might say knight takes e7, but then the king is able to recapture and you get into some tactics. Knight e5 check, king d8 is nothing special. Knight takes a7. Yeah, you're just winning the rook. Simple as that. Just take the rook on c8. We're also threatening to take the queen with check. So if Black plays knight takes knight, we're able to take the queen with check. Now we're simply taking everything. We can play queen takes queen. We can play knight takes queen. It doesn't matter, but I see a potential cool checkmate. I'm going to try to set it up. I hope our opponent plays e6. I'm going to set up a cool checkmate. Let's hope that our opponent takes the knight. Let's hope that our opponent takes the knight. Actually, even if he takes with a pawn, this checkmate works. So I could pre-move queen takes d5. Ah, Sag. Wait, let me think about how to set this up. Let's go g4, actually. Let's try to encourage Black to play queen takes d5. I'm trying to... I feel like he'll play queen takes c2, though. Yeah, our opponent is, like, debating what to do. Yeah, queen takes d5. We got it. Queen takes d5, and bishop e8 is a lovely mate to end the game. So that's that, folks. And that is the reason why you can't play the Scandi unless you know all of the theory and unless you've done John Bartholomew's Chessable course. So really nothing special about this game other than a couple of instructive moments. The first is, in this position, knight c6 is a really bad move. In most Scandi positions, you're not supposed to bring your queen's knight out to c6. You're supposed to put the pawn on c6, precisely for the reason that kind of was outlined in the game. Because anytime you play knight c6, d5 is going to be pretty terrifying. Or bishop to b5. It's just a very awkward piece in the Scandi. So you're supposed to go c6 in order to clamp down on the d5 square. And one of the main lines here continues bishop c4. Black, I think, is supposed to play bishop f5. But even if we play knight e5 and we play this very primitively, Black's position is really, really difficult to play for a newer player, if that makes sense. So knight c6, we play knight f3, very patient move. Bishop f5, now we push d5. Knight b4, knight d4 is a concept that you should kind of take to heart. And after bishop g6, probably Black should have played bishop to d7. As pathetic as this move looks, at the very least, it prevents bishop b5. After bishop g6, I think I made a very instructive mistake. I rushed the check on b5. If instead I would have played a3, I think the game would have ended even faster. Why? Because we're encouraging black to move the knight away from b4, which makes this check a lot more devastating, because after c6, knight takes c6, the game is over. If we compare this position and this position, here black has this out with queen takes queen. Here black no longer has this out, and because of that, his position collapses like a house of cards. Black literally loses all of their pieces, all of them. The queen, the knight, and then the rook. If black plays queen to b6, for example, we have this beautiful mating pattern, knight takes d5 and knight c7, checkmate. So a3 would have been a very precise move. Instead, I gave the check on b5 and played dc, which is totally fine. And just very quickly, why did I not play knight takes c6? So again, it's because after queen takes d1 check, it's a slightly awkward situation for white. You don't really want to play knight takes d1 and give away the rook in the corner. But if you play king takes d1, this king is going to be very vulnerable, and I just wasn't totally convinced by the position after a6. Black has this very cool defensive trick, a6. Now this attacks the tail of the discovery, the piece that's actually giving the discovered check. So if you move the knight away, black is able to take the bishop and maintain some chances. But if white plays bishop to a4, there's a very unfortunate tactical trick that allows black to stay in the game. Who sees it? Who sees the tactical trick that keeps black in the game? It's bishop takes c2 check. Yeah, exactly. Using the only two pieces that black has developed, black is able to disarm the discovered check and recapture on c6. And if we come back to a4, of course, white should be winning here. White is much, much better. We can just play bishop b3 and rook c1 and put pressure on the knight, but obviously I was not totally convinced by this. So, unfortunately, I didn't think that this won cleanly, which is why, in this position, I simply decided to drop back to a4. So, here, if black plays e5, now I think knight takes c6 is more convincing. Although, actually, no, actually, I think it's the same thing. Takes, if we take with the knight, again, black plays knight c2, which is really annoying. No, I think the same thing would have given black some chances. Bishop takes c2, knight takes c6, and black is okay. So, yeah, so it was a sloppy move, actually, to rush this check on b5. a3 would have been a lot more precise. So, wow. Instead, our opponent played this useless move f6, which is actually counterproductive. This allowed us to get our king to safety, and finally e5 is no longer dangerous because now, after knight takes c6, queen takes d1, if you want to be super precise here, and this is a very tricky question for y'all, if you want to be super precise, what should you do? There's a really cool move here, and it's not knight takes b4 check, because the queen is able to come back. This is something to kind of file away into your mental directory of ideas. This also happens in the Danish gambit. Like if you have the main line. The main line of the Danish gambit features this exact idea, where black gives up the queen and then recovers it, but then in order to recover the minor piece, you have to actually drag the queen back itself so that you at least get a bishop for it. So just remember this concept that when you play a move like knight takes b4, the queen itself can defend against the double attack. Where is it? Yeah, so the queen itself can defend against the discovered attack and win back the piece. The move is actually knight takes e5 check. So this prevents or takes the sting out of queen d7 because we now have two defenders on that square. And no matter where the king goes, we're able to recapture the queen with check. We have two extra pawns and a raging attack against the black king. If king e7, we take the bishop with check. Then we recapture the queen, and we're completely winning in this position. Completely winning. So, not an easy subtlety to take note of, but hopefully that made sense. Yeah, knight e5 is a difficult movement. Our opponent played rook c8, we played a3. I think the last chance for black would have been to play e5 here, but probably we can win. I don't even know actually what the move is here for white. Maybe rook e1, pinning the queen, although here black can play bishop e7. It's actually not so easy to, to deliver the crushing blow here. I would have probably just played a takes b4, queen takes d4. Now some sort of very calm move like queen to e2, trying to get into a6 and trying to set up bishop e3. Okay, but this is really advanced chess. Like sometimes when you don't see the direct win, you want to make these slower moves to kind of set yourself up for the second stage of the attack. So this, I think, is very, very strong for white. But our opponent didn't see that. He blundered into knight takes c6, and the rest was very, very obvious. Super important detail that here we're able to take the queen with a check, and we're also able to evacuate the knight. Otherwise, black would have 3 minor pieces for the queen, which is a lot of material. So kind of a cool line. Kind of a sloppy game, but still, I think pretty instructive to observe how quickly these openings crumble when you don't know exactly how to play them, which is why I recommend a much more conventional opening repertoire so that you avoid these types of games. Any questions? Okay, I think this is a good spot to call it a night. I have a lot to do tonight, and I'm pretty spent after that match with Jobava, so I'm going to get going, guys. Hope you enjoyed the speedrun. Thanks, everybody. See you later, guys.